So hopefully you've had a little break. You have already listened to part one of more training for a showdown, and are you ready for part two? We ended part one with a promise being kept. Second half of verse 15. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Sometime later. So every morning and evening, day after day, God provided. The widow went to her kitchen, looked in the bowl, and there was flour. She looked into the jar, found oil, and plenty of water and bread to eat. And we get into the next part of Elijah and the widow's story with sometime later. And that sometime later, that's how a New International Version chose to translate this transition. More of a paraphrase. A more word-for-word translation looks like this. Now it came about after these things. That was from the New American Standard. Now it happened after these things. New King James. Sometimes it seems translators are trying to clear up confusing phrases, but I think they can miss an emphasis the writer may have been intended. In this case, maybe the writer wanted the reader, that's us, to look back on the previous events in the story, and not just the immediate event of the oil and flour running out. Or at least I'm choosing to look back on all the earlier events. And I want to do so focusing on how the true God demonstrates who's in charge, who should be worshipped, Yahweh, God, or Baal. So let's look at the events, these things. So I've listed these things. And what does it show? With the drought, God showed he controls the weather, not Baal. With the ravens feeding Elijah, God showed he commands nature, not Baal. With the flour and oil, God showed he truly sustains life, not Baal. Today we'll see God showing who truly has the power, not only to sustain life, but to give life. So the story continues. Sometime later, or after these things, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Some scholars have come to the conclusion that the son was only unconscious and finally stopped breathing. I'm convinced he was dead, and I'll tell you why. The more literal translation for stopped breathing is no breath left. And that word breath is the same Hebrew word we find in Genesis 2, verse 7, where God breathed into Adam's nostrils, the breath of life. So the son lost the breath of life. The widow is grieving. She kind of lashes out at Elijah. Sadly, she blames herself, her sinful past. We don't know what it is she's done. Maybe she's a Baal worshiper, who knows. Whatever she did in the past, she's used bad theology. She's apparently not familiar, as we are, with the concept of a forgiving God. But again, this is her only loved one, and grieving does what it does. Now, was this the time to have a spiritual argument with the widow? For Elijah to have a spiritual argument? No, sometimes words aren't the solution. What is Elijah's response? "Give me your son," Elijah replied. He took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought tragedy also upon this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." So words have their time and place. Loving compassion is what she needs right now. The widow needs some loving compassion. Elijah takes the boy up to his room upstairs and he prays. The power of prayer is demonstrated here big time. Why did he stretch himself out? I don't know. I assume the Lord directed him. But it does illustrate the on your knees, hands folded is not the only way for prayer. Why 3 times? I don't know. Maybe that was under the Lord's direction too. Or maybe it was Elijah's persistence. It could be illustrating that we need to not give up when prayers aren't answered immediately. His prayers are answered, as it says in verse 22. The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." Any doubt the woman had about God or the prophet is now gone. I want to read a description of this event from Chuck Swindoll. Once, twice, 3 times Elijah stretched himself upon the boy, body to body, arm to arm, leg to leg. It was as if Elijah somehow thought a transfusion of life could occur under this canopy of contact. But Elijah was stretched in more than body. His faith strained for a miracle never before performed, reached for a mercy God had never before bestowed. And God grasped his servant's outstretched hand. Sweat beading on his forehead, Elijah held his breath and watched the boy intently. Were those his eyelids fluttering? Did his finger really twitch? Oh, how gracious and kind the Lord is. Panting, laughing, praising God, Elijah helped the boy sit up. The boy's small, pallid face brightened with a sunrise glow. His listless eyes danced with the light of life again, and Elijah's heart filled with grateful joy, a joy he could hardly wait to give to a certain mother. So I've been preparing this text. This particular scripture happens to have fallen on Mother's Day this year. This event also does show a wonderful situation with mother and son and joy. So happy Mother's Day, belatedly. This event also shows a few traits of Elijah that would be a good thing to model for all of us. I have the word here, expectation. Elijah had an expectation that God would act. The child was dead. God would and could restore him. If you're like me, your circumstances don't run into life and death situations, but whatever the circumstance, we can expect God's will to be done. Elijah had a humble attitude. Looking at verse 23 again, where he gave the child to his mother, he said, "Look, your son is alive." It was not, "Hey, look what I just did. Look what I did. Look at me." It's what God did. God gets the glory. Elijah is also a great model in his compassion, his caring. We all encounter quote-unquote widows, the broken, the helpless, the hurting. We need to be there, offer support, not necessarily fancy words. Be ready to pray. Maybe there's a miracle in store. If not a physical miracle, there can be spiritual or emotional healing. A lot to learn, just modeling Elijah's life. I just like seeing how God interacts with him. Now, Elijah's story will continue next week, but that concludes our thoughts from this scripture. So, in the meantime, we'll see you next week, and be safe, and Lord be with you.